Welcome to the grand final of Manchester Euros 2013. I would like to invite David from Edinburgh to open the case for his team and the proposition bench as a whole.
A person, let's call him David the Debater, is faced with two doors. Behind one is a hungry tiger, ready to eat whoever opens that door. Behind the other is the EUDC trophy that he so desperately wants. For the last 5 days, people who claim to know what they're talking about have reliably informed him that he should pick the left door, under the impression that that is where the trophy is. In actual fact, that's where the tiger lies. He opens the door and is tragically mauled to death. Ladies and gentlemen, David the Debater may have had a free choice to open that door insofar as there was not a person with a gun to his head forcing him to make that door. However, we do not think, because he was not adequately informed about what the consequences of that decision would be, he was acting in his best interest and he was making a genuinely free choice. Ladies and gentlemen, we powerfully believe today on proposition that we don't just give people the right to vote as a kind of token gesture to appease them and allow the state to continue with its power, but because that right to vote has the power to genuinely enhance their lives. Two things in opening government today. First of all, why we give people the right to vote and why we think it's legitimate to restrict that right to vote or to weight votes regarding on how well informed they are. Second of all, how we think this motion will improve political culture, stop campaigns that don't adequately inform citizens and lead to truly engaged democratic citizens.
Clarification.
First of all, the mechanism. I'll deal with that first, then you can have a clarification. We will have a test going along the lines of every general election cycle. For example, if the general election is every 5 years, we will have a new current affairs test every 5 years. It will take the form of a short multiple choice test, which is created by a bipartisan group of experts on these things, and that you could expect to get good marks on if you were a reasonably informed average voter, like one of the judges in front of me right now. Not yet. We think that based on that choice, your votes will be weighted from a sliding scale of 1 to 1.9. This is really important. No one is going to be completely disenfranchised from not performing well on this test. Every single person will still get one vote. It will just be weighted on the scale from 1 to 1.9. On to the first point, ladies and gentlemen, why we give people the right to vote. Because we recognise that in democracies, voting is one of the most important rights that you can bestow on an individual. It is the mechanism through which individuals can voice their opinions and make decisions that actively make their lives better. We think there are two large reasons why we give people a right to vote. Firstly, because the decisions that the state makes, the decisions that they're voting people in power to make, affect their lives. How much money is spent on the health service, what kind of education system you want, affect people's lives, ladies and gentlemen. Second of all, because people feel more enfranchised in the state if they're given that power to decide on different things about that state. If people genuinely care about them and genuinely want to hear their opinion on what they think how their country should be run, we think that people feel more enfranchised in the state. And finally, because it gives the state a legitimate mandate. It means that the state cannot just make tyrannical decisions regarding whatever they like. They actually have to listen to the voters and react to their beliefs. However, importantly, we think the right to vote should be predicated on an informed choice, ladies and gentlemen. We think the right to vote only has inherent value, right, if you're aware of the implications of what happens when you vote for a certain party.
Okay.
If you're aware what the consequences on a particular service will be when you vote for that party. We think individuals that aren't truly informed about the decisions they make are not truly free to make those decisions. They may be going under false illusions, ladies and gentlemen. Why do we think, and we think we already have established principles about why informed voting matters. We think that's why we don't grant votes to people that don't live in a country, even though they may have citizenship to that country. We think that's why we don't grant votes to mentally ill people in many countries, because we don't believe they can make genuinely informed decisions. That's the reason we don't grant votes to people under a certain age and certain decisions. Instead, we get their parents to vote on their behalf. We don't think it's enough to totally disenfranchise people and totally disregard their opinion, but we think there's a precedent for weighting individuals that are better able to take those decisions. I'll take opening.
What makes some political issues more important than others?
We think this is a general current affairs test regarding general things that are going on in society. We don't think it weights certain political issues above others. It's an indication of how generally informed a citizen is. We don't think some are more important than others. Second, so ladies and gentlemen, what happens when individuals don't make informed decisions when they vote? First of all, they may vote against their interests. Parties that can have cheap slogans, for example, far-right parties that campaign against a certain minority group without a basis there, people may vote for those parties. Second of all, they vote on factually inaccurate comments. We think if someone if a party runs on a particular policy for a health service that they claim to improve that health service, whereas actually popular academic opinion states that it won't help that health service, we think that individual isn't making an informed decision. We think the fact that many people in America don't know where Iraq is on a map affects foreign policy decisions, right? Because they don't even care about where the country that they're sending their military personnel to go and fight and die, ladies and gentlemen, is located, right? We think that leads to bad decisions in the areas of foreign policy. We think these are the hard matters of what happens when people don't make informed decisions. We think they don't act in their country's best interest. We think they don't act in their best own interest, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think they can make these decisions. Second of all, why do we think it improves political culture? Firstly, because it gives parties an incentive to inform their voters. We think particularly this will be the case for parties whose voters might not be already informed about general current affairs. Parties that rely on individuals making rely on individuals making decisions based on how their parents vote. We'd point for the example for the Labour Party in the UK, which relies on safe seats, whereas people generally follow a certain political culture. At the point in which it's at the risk that those votes may be worth less than other people that are better informed, we think it gives an incentive for parties like the Labour Party to go into those districts and inform their voters on current affairs. Second of all, it prevents parties running media campaigns with just single slogans that don't analyse issues and don't analyse the true consequences of those issues. It encourages parties to go out there and spend time with their candidates, spend time with the electorate and educate them and fully explain how their policies will help them. Thirdly, it gives parties an incentive to campaign on better education in general, right? So to introduce more weight onto current affairs in the curriculum, right, in education systems, so that everyone can make informed decisions. And most importantly, it means that citizens genuinely have a vested interest in their country and are genuinely informed. For better democratic culture, and because we think voters can only act in their interests if they're adequately informed, I beg you to propose.
I'd like to thank David for his speech and invite the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for Trinity College Dublin and the opposition bench as a whole.
Mr. Speaker, they're espousing a policy which allows states to shape the narratives that most suit them in public discourse, that allows states power over what fact is, and allows states to decide what people should think is important and what people should think about those issues and about how they should feel and what is factually correct. I'm going to talk to you first about poor votes and how you disenfranchise those people who are most economically deprived in the state and how you harm them the most on their side of the house. And secondly, I want to talk about state narratives and the problems that this creates in terms of scrutiny over state policy. First, though, three things that don't fit in elsewhere. One, Sally asks them why some issues are more important than others. Their answer is to not answer. Their answer is to say, we're going to have literally every political issue on this test. Note that they tell you that it's going to be a short, multiple-question test. We're not sure how that one's going to play out. We think there is literally an infinite number of political issues. We think people decide individually what issues are important to them. It's not clear how they get coverage of those things. We would have liked an actual answer to that POI.
On this.
Secondly, the idea that they seem to be hinting at, throughout their speech, that there are objectively good policy outcomes and that those outcomes can be objectively determined via academia. Two problems there. First of all, people want different things from policy outcomes, so it's not clear what objectively objectively good means, we do think people weigh those things up. Subjectively, we do think this makes it harder for them to do so. But secondly, there doesn't tend to be an agreement of academic opinion on what policies will do. This allows states to selectively include those academic opinions which vindicate their narratives, right? Third thing, they use the word bipartisan. It's just genuinely unclear to us what that means, unless they're basing this in the US, in which case it's the Democrats and the Republicans. More on that later. It is clear, though, that they're using political elites to make these decisions. More on that also later. Fourth, they tell you that people can only vote in their own interests if they are informed. The thought experiment he gives you with the tiger and the trophy at the start is premised upon his own decision to want to be more informed to get that trophy. We do think people are entitled to decide what their own interests are. We do think they're entitled to decide whether that requires them to have a knowledge of current affairs. They never tell you why voters have an obligation to be well informed. There just isn't a philosophical case for that in their speech. No thank you. Let's talk then about the votes of the economically deprived. This biases the electoral process in favour of those who are wealthy. Why? First, because their test is being formulated by people who are bipartisan, which is to suggest that they are by people who are either in the civil service and then probably middle class, or who are taking directives from political elite, should they not be political elite themselves, in which case they're middle to upper class, right? We think that they formulate issues which are in their interest, and issues which they want to discuss, and issues which come into play in their own personal perspectives. They empower people according to their capacity to follow the media. That applies, first, to people who have more luxury time, richer people, people who have more education, richer people, and finally to people with better media access, that is to say people who can buy a wider range of papers, or people who can use smartphones and other kinds of technology to stay in touch with like 24-hour media cycles. Richer people, Mr. Speaker. It is not clear to us why they want to do this. It is not clear why those people who are economically deprived in society, who are most likely to like live or die on the basis of government policy, who are most likely to depend on state welfare for their living, and who are therefore most affected by government policy, ought to have the least power over that policy. You leave these people unable to articulate their political preferences, you make them weaker. Two problems here. The first is that they tell you that the right to vote is important because it makes people feel enfranchised, because it makes people want to cooperate with their state. We think when you take away power from those people who are less engaged with media cycles and who have less money, we think you do alienate them from the state. That's bad by their own metric. But secondly, you get worse policy outcomes because you don't hear input from those people. You don't hear input from the ground level of what it is like to be on welfare, of how hard it might be to live on a given amount of welfare, or how important it might be that certain bureaucratic processes be changed. You don't hear those voices because you give those people less votes. You disenfranchise them. Go.
Under the status quo, poor people are disenfranchised by systematic campaigns of vilification and misinformation by the media and politicians. We remove that incentive and we create a massive incentive to inform the poor so the politicians can gain their vote. That is not a problem which you are presenting to us.
You just told us that media and politicians collude to vilify poor people. Your test is being set by politicians. It's not clear why we should believe that this will vilify poor people less, and this is my second point, so we'll go on to it now. Let's talk about state narratives. They are trying to establish a curriculum of legitimate political knowledge. They are trying to tell people what is topical, first of all, and secondly, what is important and how important those topical issues are. Because they are defining certain issues as being the issues that you need to know about in order to vote. So whether that's like the economic policies being espoused by the current government, or whether that's, whatever, foreign policy outcomes which are desired by the current government, or the state of global affairs, right? These things are necessarily premised upon the status quo because they are being developed by status quo state bodies and by state apparatuses, and that is problematic, right? Why? First, because as Matt tells you in that POI, states and media collude to form narratives which facilitate their own interests and which legitimate their own actions. Some examples of this: the Red Scare, the Cold War, the War on Terror. These are all examples of factual circumstances. So, for example, the likelihood of a terrorist attack upon the United States, which are drastically overstated by politicians and by media, and we recognize that there are business interests which play into both politics and into the media. By playing up those facts, by playing up those narratives, by suggesting that terrorist attacks are particularly likely, it becomes easier for states to pursue aggressive counter-terrorism policies. It becomes easier for them to spy on their citizens. It becomes easier for them to invade the nations that they want to invade. right? That's problematic because states get to use facts as weapons. That is only accentuated when you have fewer votes if you're not willing to sign off on the state's version of what the facts are. States lie, we don't trust them, we're not sure why they do. Second, let's talk about alternative conceptions of what is important. Because it is subjective, because we do think that people weigh up political issues and decide what they want. They tell you that they're all going to be on the test. They're not going to be all on the test. So we talk about international poverty, something that it's not much in the state's interest to discuss, something that neither the Democratic Party, for example, nor the Republican Party have a particularly vested interest in, because it's not particularly popular with the business interests that give them money. We talk about women's rights. We talk about the levels of suicide in the US military. All of these facts are facts which are inconvenient for the state, are issues which it is inconvenient for the state to discuss or for the dominant political parties or their administrations to discuss. It is not clear why states are not incentivized on their side of the House to give less political clout to those people who agree with the state and who agree with the administration about what is important. This places inordinate amounts of power in the hands of states that Matt tells you in his POI are untrustworthy, and it disenfranchises the most vulnerable people in society. We are incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank Mike for his speech and ask Marlena to continue the case for Edinburgh and the proposition bench as a whole.
Isaac Asimov once said that anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread through our political and cultural life, which is formed by the false notion that my ignorance is as good as your knowledge. On side proposition, we firmly believe that individuals consistently vote against their own interests because of the fact that they don't know what they're voting for. I want to bring you two things today. First, I want to talk about the nature of campaigning, specifically for the poor, explain why it's better under our model and why they're more enfranchised. Second, what I want to discuss is the way that this changes political and educational culture, how this is beneficial not just for elections, but for general democratic citizenship. First, I have 5 points of rebuttal. The first issue is that we have power over what fact is. It is not a loaded question, ladies and gentlemen, to have a map and say, label Iraq. Like, not every question is necessarily political. There are some things which are literally just facts, right? Second, who's going to set the test? We were going to say it was going to be a nonpartisan test, but then obviously you would stand up and say nothing's nonpartisan. So we said it would be bipartisan, as in there's going to be a panel of people from different political backgrounds, as everything is political, who will set the test. It is not in the interest of any parties to make sure that it's going to be swayed in one way or the other. Therefore, they will constantly work to make sure that it is as non-political as possible. Third, there are infinite numbers of political issues, right? If there is a question which is saying, are all people covered by healthcare, because healthcare is consistently a question asked about in every general election, that's pretty important for us on side proposition. Although there might be infinite numbers of political issues, there are the same hot topics which come up at every single election, and that misinformation continues to mean that people vote in the wrong way. Just general basic questions about, like, how many people are on benefits, like the percentage of which are benefit scroungers, etc., etc. The fact that working families constitute the vast majority of benefit expenditure in the United Kingdom, in addition with pensioners, would kind of take away a lot of that rhetoric, right? Fourth. So he said that states overemphasize terrorist attacks. This is a wonderful way to make that not happen. If we have a question saying, when is the last time that a terrorist attack happened on our soil, right? Like, that's the kind of question which would allow people to be informed. Lastly, there are facts which are inconvenient for a state to discuss. What he talks about already isn't being discussed. It is not the case that there is massive amounts of time being spent on international poverty. So people aren't voting on misinformation about international poverty because it doesn't even reach the political discourse, or the political dialogue in the first place. Making that entire point is, like, completely irrelevant. He's not engaging with the real issues. What he says, right, going on to our main substantive, no. The nature of campaigning. Right now, we say that under under his model, under the status quo, democracy favors the wealthy, the rich, and the powerful. It is not the case that under his side, the poor are really living it up and living to their true democratic, ideals. What we think, no. is the fact that, like, specifically, no matter how many campaign finance laws you have in place, it's still going to be the case that wealthy people are going to be better connected. It's still going to be the case that, like, the vast majority of elected representatives in this country and in many other countries went to private schools when they were younger and then private schools when they were older. As a result of that, like, whether we get truly liberal policies is genuinely a question. But why does it change under our model? We don't think that it is a big shock that poor people know that their votes don't count that much right now. We think that that's why they turn up in, like, less numbers all the time than the, like, wealthy middle-class people. It is already the case that wealthy votes cost more, or pardon me, are given more weighting than poor votes. What changes under our model is the fact that poor people feel like they finally can have more of a say than their means would otherwise dictate. It means that poor people who are informed and who recognize that, like, they know educational, like, issues and they know current affairs, because we think it is an absolute lie for opposition to stand up here and claim that just because you are working class, you probably don't know where Iraq is, right? We point to, like, the vast swathes of American Republicans who live in California and are incredibly wealthy and still don't know where Iraq is, right? We think that it is the situation, which is incredibly important. It's that poor people constantly vote in a way which they wouldn't vote if they knew the facts. That, do you know why? For the same reasons that you talk about. The fact is, by virtue of the fact that poor people, like, have less educational attainment, they have, like, less, like, educational knowledge, it means that, like, it's incredibly easy to lie to them, which is why campaigns are bad. Xenophobia, homophobia, sexism, all of those things which people consistently, like, spread out to the poor because they think they're going to buy it. They, like, portray it for the lowest common denominator, and they make political campaigns to do so. As a result of that, consistently in the United States, poor people in the South always vote to take away welfare spending despite the fact that they need it more than anyone. Like, that's the problem that we have on side proposition. They're not actually exercising their democratic rights because they don't know the facts upon which they're exercising them. If they knew, like, the numbers of, like, the expenditure of welfare, if they knew what the parties actually wanted to do, then they'd be much less likely to vote in that way. We think that poor people are going to be more likely to turn out. They're going to feel more enfranchised by the system. We think, no thank you, that, like, the problems of xenophobia, especially in the United Kingdom, and the rise of UKIP could be incredibly well combated by honest educational, like, questions about whether or not, like, it was going to be acceptable for, like, European Union citizens to come and simply benefit scrounge without having any kind of a job or any kind of, like, legal right to live in that country. Just so you guys know, that doesn't happen. It's illegal. However, people constantly vote on it. And as a result of that, we have massive rises in incredibly xenophobic parties, which also alienate large groups of the population because they say that they're not allowed to live there. So the lambasting of entire groups is something which, like, doesn't just end after an electoral cycle. It perpetuates within society consistently. I'd love to take closing or opening. Anyone really? Go.
Okay. Why do voters who know more about the location of Iraq than, say, women's issues in Somalia deserve more political power than their counterparts?
If you know about women's issues in Somalia, you also probably know where Iraq is. It gives you better policies because at the point that the parties which come into power are parties which were voted on by a more educated electorate, they're probably going to stick true to their promises because people feel like they have made an informed choice. They did so based on a current affairs test, and they can hold their government to account. As a result of that, you have a more engaged voter base than you ever would have had before. And the way that this changes political and, like, educational culture is just like David said. There is constantly a view to educating the populace about what your views are. That's completely ignored on side opposition. Under their model, it is so easy to have, like, one statement or one tagline, which is like get the foreigners out of our country, and people vote for that because they don't recognize that, like, there aren't as many foreigners in their country as they actually would think so. People lie to the poor. Poor people constantly vote against their own interests. It's unjust. It's a-democratic. I'm incredibly happy to propose.
I'd like to thank Marlena for her speech and invite Sally to continue the case for Trinity College Dublin and the opposition bench as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to talk to you about poor voters, and I want to talk to you about radical voters and radical politics. So, firstly, to clash with what we've just heard from opening proposition, we're told that there will now be a huge incentive for the government to educate poor people about what they want poor people to know. But if Marlena is correct, then when poor people find out the truth that the government has apparently up till now been hiding from them, they will want to replace that government and vote for entirely different policies from those they're already voting for. We don't understand in that case why a government would ever be incentivized to give poor people the information that Marlena thinks that they now want to give them, given that this will apparently radicalise the poor to an extent that they're not radicalised already. It's just unclear why a state would want to give the poor information that will, in Marlena's version of reality, inevitably lead to that administration being kicked out of power. It just doesn't make sense. No, thank you. We told you why poor people are likely to perform poorly on this test. Why is that? Because they have less time to read current affairs magazines like The Economist. No, thank you. Because they have less money to spend on those magazines, because they have less access to technology to allow them to access the kind of geographical knowledge that is apparently going to be the only question that appears on this on this multiple choice test. We think that's bizarre. Iraq isn't a current affair. Its location isn't a current affair. Iraq's been there for quite a while. No, thank you. Obviously, they're going to have to prioritise certain political issues that are current, and they're going to have to decide what those current issues are. We don't think it's fair to characterise this, no thank you, as being able to place a pin in a map and then getting 1.9 of a vote. Clearly, this has to do with political prioritisation, no thank you, which you are placing in the government's hands and hoping that the media do a good job of educating the poor. They don't do it already, no thank you, they're going to do it a lot less well now. We think that this is particularly harmful because it disenfranchises, no thank you, those specific parties who have less access to the kind of current affairs knowledge they're talking about, because those parties are more likely, as they tell us, to be dependent on the state. Now they have almost half as much a vote as the people who are less likely, no thank you, to depend on the state. We think that those people actually probably do know whether or not they'd like more social welfare. We think it's condescending to suggest that they don't. We would also suggest, if you're living on welfare and you want welfare to be cut, fine. That's a legitimate political belief. If you don't want as much welfare, no thank you, as you're getting, it's well within your rights to say, I don't think the state should be taking other people's taxes to give me welfare. That's a political belief. It's not a lie. It's not wrong. It's just what you believe. No thank you. We'd also suggest that now, poor communities have less political power because they have fewer votes to agitate for the kind of educational changes that they apparently think are going to come about as a result of this policy. It can't happen because they now can't vote for it to happen because they have half as many votes as people who have a subscription to The Economist. We just think that that's incredibly unfair because these people need those votes more than anyone. We're also told, no thank you, that this will end racism, that this will end sexism. Sexism, Mr. Speaker, is not a lie. It is a system of belief. No, thank you. We don't think that any one fact is going to convince a misogynist that women are equal. We don't think that that can happen because it's not an objective fact that women are equal. It's an axiomatic belief that I, and presumably most people here, hold very dear to our hearts. No, thank you. But it's not a fact, Mr. Speaker. It's just a system of belief that we hold. So we can't say that this will, help to eliminate anti-immigrant sentiment unless every question is specifically devised only to allow liberal voters to get that 1.9 of the vote, in which case we think that's incredibly unfair because we think Conservatives should be allowed to vote too. But secondly, no thank you, on radical voters and how they're disenfranchised by this metric. We think that radical voters, first of all, just to establish this, are incredibly important to a healthy democracy. Why is that? No thanks. Because we don't think that this is the end of history, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that the Western liberal democracy has reached its final form and this is the absolute best we can do for everyone. No thank you. Where the poor get drip-fed welfare and everyone else, no thank you, does much better than that. We think that it's quite legitimate to feel that the information the state is giving you is just one form of knowledge and that other forms of knowledge exist. No thank you. Which would suggest that perhaps the whole electoral process, that the whole bipartisan system, where only two parties can have legitimate opinions on political issues, is in itself completely unfair. No, thank you. We think that voters who feel that a two-party system, which they essentially admit this is going to be designed by, that two-party system is incredibly limited and cannot give people the human rights they deserve, still should have their voices heard in a political system. Why is this unlikely to happen under their metric? Because their test is designed by people who have strong incentives to perpetuate that exact version of democracy, because it's a bipartisan committee who set this test. And yeah, closing.
No vote takes place in a vacuum. We do not remove the ability of people to allocate their own preferences. We just ensure that when they are voting, they are aware of the issues that affect everyone, not just on them. Why is that not legitimate?
Okay. Thank you for telling me that some issues affect everyone and others don't. What we're questioning is that, for example, were you to care deeply about something that's never in the news, like international poverty or global debt, or the fact that Western governments consistently use capitalism to screw the developing world, then maybe you wouldn't have much time to keep up with the economists' opinions on Syria. But we think that your form of knowledge is just as valuable and deserves just as much of a vote as anyone else's. We think it is perfectly legitimate to dedicate your, in many cases, very limited education time,
Sally?
no thank you, to educating yourself about things that are outside the remit of what governments in the West decide are current affairs. We think that in some cases, only through doing that, only through deciding to forego those specific kinds of knowledge and deciding to pursue kinds of knowledge that have been denied to you by Western educational systems, can you actually become a voting actor who is able to critique the kind of Western liberal democracies in which we find ourselves, the kind of flaws that they tell you about in first proposition, the fact that we live in incredibly unfair societies that disenfranchise huge amounts of people, but they're not willing to do anything about it except to give the bipartisan two-party Western liberal democracy system more and more power and to allow it to take more and more power out of the hands of the poor and the radical. Mr. Speaker, we think this makes politics so much worse. We think that this says there's only one kind of knowledge that a voter can have. If you have another kind of knowledge, if you have an alternative ideology, if you think that the facts that the government and the media want to tell you aren't true, then you're not part of our state. You're only half a citizen. You're not 1.9 of a citizen. You're just one. We think that, Western liberal democracies are flawed in exactly the way that they suggest. They tell you there are non-political facts. We ask you, why is it relevant to find Iraq, but not relevant to find Somalia, not relevant to find the DRC, not relevant to find the places that Western liberal democracies have decided to forget about and want you to forget about too? Why is it relevant that, more people in the military have committed suicide in the American military than have died in combat? Why is that not part of our current affairs? Because the media don't want you to know about it, because the governments don't want you to know about it, and if you decide to learn about that instead of learning about what they want you to know, you only get half a vote, Mr. Speaker. For all these reasons, we're so happy to stand on the opposition.
I'd like to thank Sally for her speech and invite Tash to open the case for Oxford and continue the proposition bench.
Okay, I can't work that stopwatch. Misinformation does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs when politicians conspire deliberately to misinform their voters, their electorate. When Maurice Glassman stands up and says, we're moving towards blue Labour, we're telling you that polls steal your jobs, we're telling you that there are thousands and thousands of benefit scroungers, it's not just the Tory party who are playing into demonising the poor. It's the Labour Party who conspire with those narratives and then twist them and play into a general political consensus about issues. When the Labour Party systematically disenfranchise their voters by lying to them, that's quite problematic. We think we encourage a healthy political discourse where people don't lie to their own electorate, when they have an incentive to challenge common misconceptions. And we think that that's incredibly important in empowering the poor today. So, I'm going to talk about, ideally, three things. First of all, number one, why this fits into a philosophical conception of voting. Secondly, why minorities are disenfranchised, and specifically the mechanism as how they're re-enfranchised, something Marlena did not tell you. Then thirdly, I'm going to tell you about how the liberal elite respond in the policy arena, direct rebuttal to what Sally told us about radical parties. First of all, however, a little bit of rebuttal. Number one, no, I'm dealing with misinformation campaigns later. Number two, we're told effectively that selection of political issues is in itself a political choice. States have reasons to put certain things on tests and not others. Number one, it is a bipartisan group. It is not in the hands of the government, right? It is different. The state is very different to a bipartisan body. Number two, we think the salience of issues is fairly intuitive, right? Certain things consistently come up. So budget allocation is an important way of seeing what issues might be really important. Welfare is a huge proportion of budget, therefore probably there will be questions about that. Similarly, knowledge about healthcare is an enormous part of budget allocation. Those are fairly good indicators of what might be important issues. That's not a political choice, it's literally a numerical fact. Why isn't it?
Given that opening tell us that they think people will vote in an extremely reliable fashion with this new information that they're given, why do you need to weight their votes at all? Why not just publish these facts on the ballot?
Because it's quite a long list, and people won't read it, they'll just skip it. You need to provide some kind of active incentive for people to be informed. I'm going to deal with radical votes, my third point. Okay, on to substantive. So, what we told you was that it's not just an expression of preferences, an expression of actual, it's an expression of informed preferences, right? So if I vote to get rid of all immigration because I think people are stealing my jobs, but I don't realise that EU regulation means there'll still be Polish people, there just won't be scientists and engineers, right? That's probably a useful way of me being informed and being able to express my preferences more accurately, to not screw over my economy, right? So, for example, that question might be phrased something like, what are the current percentage of immigrants, or would Poles be affected by an immigration cap? We think all of those are kind of examples of questions.
Okay.
Okay, secondly, we say, though, no thank you. Voting is partially based on the fulfillment of duty, right? We think it's really important that your expression of preferences creates a certain degree of social buy-in, right? We say that we don't envisage, currently democracy being broken down by people being upset. But we do think that, for example, people are more hateful, they're more aggressive to their common person because they don't know what's going on and they don't currently feel that they're being represented. We think a more representative democratic system reduces that and therefore fulfills that kind of social duty towards people. In addition, right, we think that actually, particularly with minority groups, right, where you're particularly reliant on the state, as conceded by First Prop, preferences are often much more homogenous, right? Because you're much more reliant on the state. You can't financially detach yourselves from the decisions that they are making. We think, therefore, for example, racial, religious, geographic lines all dictate how preferences are expressed. And we think that, therefore, a single vote will never change anything. You're reliant on other people and other people within your groups being informed about what's going on. Therefore, you have a duty not just to yourself to be informed about these things, right? These are not other facts that are just relevant to you. They're relevant because you have a duty to help people amplify their votes and help democracy go on. That's why we're allowed to do it to people. And we think that's particularly consistent in minority groups who are systematically disenfranchised at the moment, right? How are we going to enfranchise minority groups? No, thank you. We think we're going to do it through effectively a couple of reasons. Three, specifically. Number one, there's a flagging mechanism, right? We think if you think that you know what's going on, but in the first general election you get one vote, you may realise that there's something going on with the kind of quality of information you're getting. You may therefore seek to remedy that in some way by saying, hang on, the kind of newspapers I'm reading are systematically misinforming me. That may be problematic, and you may seek to address that. Secondly, we say, particularly in groups which are systematically underinformed, there are quite strong community links. We look at things like working men's clubs, we look at things like religious groups. Souls to the Poles in America, for example, is a really good example of African-American low-income enfranchisement by using a network of evangelical churches to do voter registration. We say, similarly, there are incentives now for those working men's clubs to do things like make sure that people know this kind of information because there's a sense of community solidarity, and therefore you want to make sure that your desires are expressed. We think that's the kind of mechanisms where people become informed. It's not that you have to sit down and watch a 24 news cycle, but there might be, for example, a discussion at your next church group or a homily on it about a little bit of information about immigration. We think that's the kind of thing that will result in people being more informed. Thirdly, we say the political community is like a really important reason to do it, right? Because spin systematically misinforms people. We say, however, when everyone colludes, right, when the Labour Party collude to systematically misinform people about immigration because they think it will be politically convenient, they're thus disenfranchising a large section of their electoral base. We say we give specifically politicians to make an active choice to try and inform their electoral base in what's going on. We say that's particularly important, right? For certain ethnic and minority groups, we think a significant countervailing narrative is a really important way of doing this. Let's talk about how the liberal elite respond. Okay, so number one, we think it might reduce politically extreme voting because often it is based on misinformation. We say low-income groups are disproportionately misinformed and they are disproportionately representative of radical voting. We don't actually necessarily have a problem with radical voting. We have a problem when it doesn't express your policy preferences, right? We say, however, if there is still a strong current of radical voting, at the moment it is possible for the Tory party to say, people just don't know what's going on with the EU. They can't distinguish between the EU and the ECHR. Therefore, votes for UKIP are partially irrelevant because we don't have to respond to these issues because people don't know what they're talking about. When there is still, for example, a significant vote for extreme parties, you realise that people do know what's going on and they also care about these issues. Therefore, policy preferences have to be adequately represented, even if they don't fit within a liberal debated framework. We think it is exceptionally possible to disenfranchise people by claiming they're ignorant. When they actually turn out and vote for things that the liberal elite disagree with, they have to respond to get those votes. They can't just brush them on the carpet. I'm terribly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Natasha for her speech and invite Ashish to open the case for Cambridge and continue the opposition bench as a whole.
Mr. Speaker, I am a Singaporean. My heart leaps up when I behold creepy, elitist policies that disenfranchise the poor. I really do. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I can also recognize that sometimes my opinions are wrong, and I am so proud to oppose this disgusting motion. For several reasons. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the principles of democracy. Because so far, for some ridiculous reason, this debate has only focused on the poor. They are a group that we ought to talk about. But they are not the only group at stake here, because the poor are merely symptomatic of a wider problem with the very conception of democracy that has been presented before us today. What are the other groups I'm going to talk about? Firstly, I'm going to talk about people who are single-issue voters. I'm also going to talk about voters who choose to vote based on character. I'm going to talk about voters who choose to vote on purely local issues and ignore all other geopolitical issues, because you know what? You think in a democracy that you have a right to be quite ignorant about some things you don't really think are important in the very first place, and there's a huge cost to this. Before that, quite a lot of rebuttal. The first thing they say is this will increase outreach, because if you find out that when you go and vote, your vote only counted for one vote, firstly, how will you even know that your vote only counted for one vote? Like, do you receive a letter in the mail afterwards saying, EDL supporter, your vote was only counted as one vote, in which case, interesting new policy. But two, why won't this guy just lie? He thinks, the government wants me to put down this answer, so he puts down answer A while believing answer B is true, and when he votes, he still votes on answer B anyway, right? So people will just memorize the correct test answers,
Ashish.
put down the correct test answers, but the parties they vote for and the opinions they have, even when they're 1.9 on your scale, still reflect the horrible biases that you think are going to happen. Here's the thing, right? People who don't belong in the mainstream parties, which will be sidelined in whatever process you want to put into, are not going to believe that what the government tells them is true. They are not that naive. So this was a ridiculous policy. First, then they furthermore said there'll be outreach because of, you want to reach out to the poor vote and there's large amounts of them. And that's not true, because the interests of the poor and the rich are very often mutually exclusive to quite a large degree, right? Partisan politics is already split along, no thank you, often poor-rich lines, despite the fact that they said, the Labour Party is demonizing the poor, right? What happens naturally is that parties emerge and cater for these groups because there's still votes to be had out there anyway. The problem is, if you are from the Republican Party, for instance, all your fundings and all your donors are still fairly rich. Those interests still exist. If you're from the Democrats, you still cater, no thank you, mostly to the disenfranchised to a larger degree. Right? So there's no comparative change there, because under current party systems, you already have an incentive to reach out to whatever base you happen to have. And since voting is polarized along socio-economic lines so often, you already have this sort of incentive structure. Yeah.
At the moment, collusion happens because there is no disincentive not to. When that collusion will actively impact upon the gravity and the traction which your voter base is able to enact, why does that incentive to collude to misinform continue?
There is an incentive to not collude, because if both parties shut out the poor, then you're missing out on a huge number of votes. which is why historically that's not how parties have worked. Because that's why in the vast majority of democracies around the world, one party is much more pro-welfare and another party is much more pro-low taxation. So that's a very strange world that you're living in there. So what actually happens is a massive lag problem, right? Because the party that now caters for the disenfranchised needs to work harder than the party that caters for the rich to give people that information. There's huge opportunity costs involved in this sort of action, and you disenfranchise the parties that will always be lagging behind the richer party in terms of the votes it gets. Either that, no thank you, or people just lie. So, principles of democracy, I'll deal with quite a lot of what they said integrated within my perspective. We do not believe that democracy is about deciding what a good decision for a human being is and then designing our political system to achieve that particular good decision. Democracy is about two things. No thank you. It is about, first of all, allowing people to prioritize what they think is important or what is not. Here's an interesting fact. Every single person in this room, no thank you, is a current affairs expert. You are all current affairs experts on your own lived lives and how the policies of governments have affected your life. No thank you, right? If you're a homosexual and one party doesn't want to have gay marriage, you don't need to have knowledge of current affairs to make that issue upon which you vote, right? So people are allowed to be fairly ignorant. I can say, screw Libya, screw Iraq, screw the number of immigrants in this country. I just want to vote for the party who's going to do this for me. Perfectly legitimate choice, because democracy doesn't tell you what you need to know to make a good decision a lot of the time. No, thank you. Democracy is also about restraining structures of power. And I'm going to tell you why their policy today creates structures of power that oppress specific classes of voters who we think can vote in perfectly rational and perfectly protectable ways that should not be biased by this particular system. First of all, single issue voters, right? No, thank you. Many people in the Midwest, as they pointed out, vote for the Republican Party because they believe, for instance, that certain social structures like marriage should be defined in a certain way, or because they believe that abortion is wrong because God says abortion is wrong. I do not know why a person, no thank you, with more current affairs knowledge has more access to either Kant or God than a person who chooses to vote in this way, right? So there's a systemic incommensurability between people's interests here, and you do in fact artificially prioritize some. No thank you. I can vote no thank you in a fairly ontological fashion that doesn't require very much information, apart from what my doctrines or my local leaders tell me that's valid as well. That's how lots of people vote. Also, same thing, right? No thank you. If you're a person who's racially oppressed or you're homosexual, it's perfectly fine for us to make you vote purely on that issue alone. And if you happen to be like an ignorant homosexual about the Libyan war, right? That doesn't mean that you should have less capacity to vote than a person, no thank you, who doesn't care about your interests. There are many other things apart from knowledge that count as well, like the intensity of your interest that you have in a particular subject. If you very intensely care about one thing, no thank you, because life is short and time is a zero-sum game, you care less about other things. So people who are particularly affected by one or two issues get crowded on all the other things, even though they're the most affected by it and have the right to vote on nothing else. So we tell you disenfranchise them. People also choose to vote on character and local leadership. I might believe that what a politician tells me is the correct thing. I might decide I don't have enough time in my life to figure out all these things, right? I might decide I want to outsource, as it were, my choice to a particular expert or particular person on TV. Why can I not outsource my choice in this way, given that, as I said, life is choice, and for people who are poor, as the opening pointed out, there's a huge upcost engaging in these sorts of things. Local voters. Why do I need to know where Iraq is on the map or any foreign affairs issue at all? I have a right. Look, libertarians in the status quo can vote in a way that says, screw the poor, let them die. Why cannot I vote in a way that says, screw the Iraqis, I think they can die? I do not care about that. I only care about the fact that, Obama's so-and-so policy is wrong. And the fact that you test people on all these issues means that you force them to spend time and effort to learn some things that they either don't want to learn, or you disenfranchise parties that cater for these people because they are always going to lag behind parties that cater for the more well-informed. For several fairly intuitive and strong reasons, I'd like to urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank Ashish for his speech and invite Matt to close out the case for Oxford and the proposition bench as a whole.
Earlier this year, in the north of England, a man named Mick Philpott burned down his house, killing the 6 children who were inside. Mick Philpott was a benefits claimant. In the aftermath of that tragedy, both the right-wing media and the Conservative Party attempted to portray Mick Philpott and his 6 children and his £1 million council house as emblematic of Benefits Britain. When that happens, first of all, you victimise the poor in an unacceptable way. You play into the existing prejudices and misinformation biases of wealthy voters because you can get away with it. Under our model, you remove that capacity because now politicians are actively incentivised to provide proper information. Because when they do not, they first of all miss out on potentially lucrative demographics at the ballot box, and secondly, and as Tasha points out and goes wholly unresponded to, that if you misinform your own voters, their vote is worth less. That is why we win this debate. In taking the debate for Oxford, I'm going to do 4 things, no thanks. First of all, I'm going to respond directly to Ashish's material.
Information, sir.
Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why this test is a legitimate mechanism, no thanks. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about misinformation, how it is reduced on our side of the House. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about the right to vote and what that entails in our society. So first of all, no thanks in terms of Ashish's material. The first things he tells you is, why is everyone focusing on the poor? Tasha gives you several good reasons for this. First of all, they are the most peculiarly dependent group in society upon the state. Secondly, they often have homogenous preferences which are easy to isolate and are easy, as a result of those homogenous preferences, it is easy for elites to oppress them and disenfranchise them. No thanks. He also points out the very reason why we have to talk about the poor. Because as he says, often the interests of the poor and the rich are mutually exclusive. At the point at which governments can no longer get away with systematically misinforming people, you now ensure that the rich, if they want to be able to exercise their votes to their fullest capacity, are informed about the consequences and ramifications that their vote has on the most vulnerable group in society. No thank you. We remove the ability of parties to collude. Ashish says, well, you're not going to really have collusion because it is not in parties' interest to do so. What parties do is they collude on a narrative that may be false but is nonetheless currently working. That is why both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party push images of benefits as being skivers and scroungers, okay? They cannot get away with doing that under our policy because they lose the potential votes of the poor. They also lose the ability of their own voters to get those votes because if they are misinformed, they will perform badly in this test and as a result, they will see their voting capacity not. No thank you. Second thing Ashish talks to you about is single-issue voters. This is really great, right? We're happy for people to decide what issue is most important to them. The only way in which you can decide on how important an issue is for you is if you have first of all informed yourself of the whole array of issues. Under the status quo, single-issue voters are disenfranchised, okay, because they do not have the incentive to inform themselves of the whole array of votes. Under the status quo, single-issue voters are not, in many cases, are not properly exercising their preferences. We are ensuring they are informing themselves of the whole array of voters. Finally, he says, why can't I just care about the consequences of what happens in Iraq? Why can't I just dislocate myself from this? A couple of things here. First of all, voting doesn't take place in a vacuum, and the capacity of my vote to influence change is tethered to the ability, is tethered to you enacting your vote in an appropriate way, and I'll take opening in a second. But moreover, these guys tell you this, why can't you outsource your choice to someone else? You can't outsource your choice to someone else properly and as an expression of your preference until you know who is the best person to outsource that choice for. This is a phenomenally empowering proposition. Sally.
Before the Iraq War, would a bipartisan state committee have considered the presence of weapons of mass destruction in that nation a fact about current affairs?
Okay, so obviously we can't guard against everything that is changing all the time and rapidly changing. Under our policy, we're making sure that people are keeping up to speed with these events, and as a result can leverage political change on their politicians in the intermittent, between elections. But moreover, what we say is that you could have asked questions about, are we spending enough on defence? What do you think about, what is a historically successful counter-terrorism policy? I think that issue is largely awash in this debate. So on to the main sort of points here. First of all, in terms of legitimacy, these guys ask you, why is it okay to tether your vote to mine? That is because it already is. The ability of me to properly express my preferences and to have that reflected in the election of government is contingent upon you enacting your vote in a proper way. They are telling us that you are making value judgments. We are not making a normative change here. We are making a procedural change. The very premise of democracy is that it is based on people properly enacting their preferences. You cannot have a well-informed preference and actually know how those preferences affect you and those around you until you have taken it upon yourselves to be informed of lots of different issues. Why do we achieve that on our side of the house? This is about the point about misinformation. This is what Tash brings you in extension. A few ways in which we empower people to become more informed and make better decisions. First of all, because of the flagging mechanism of having your vote reduced. Secondly, because of community groups, okay? Working men's clubs, Souls to the Polls in the United States. In order for those groups to be able to levy proper political change, they now have to ensure that their voters are kept up to speed on issues. This is also healthy because it ensures that actually they are now empowered to make single-issue decisions because they know their true position in society to a better extent. At that point, they are able to make better political decisions, both for them and for others in society. Moreover, you remove the ability of politicians and the right-wing media to vilify and victimise poor people, because the result of that vilification, when it is false, is that your voters will score badly and you will be unable to enact the sort of political change in other areas that you want. Secondly, on this, we remove the incentives for spin. Okay? We also remove the incentives for spin from the liberal elite, a point that Tash raises and goes completely unresponded to by Cambridge. At the moment, politicians can brush UKIP under the carpet as crazies. When their traction at the ballot box increases because their voters are actually informed and are making those decisions based on a broad array of the facts, politicians now have to sit up and take notice and ensure they are delivering democracy for everyone, not just for the few. Finally, in terms of the right to vote, we tell you that your right to vote is fundamentally attached to mine. In order for both of us to properly express our preferences, we need to know how that vote is going to be impacted in society. As a result, it is a legitimate thing to do to inflate the value of my vote to sufficiently divorce me from the consequences of your vote if you are enacting it in a way which is uninformed. What this will do, though, is ensure that all potential voters are more informed. It isn't just enough to give them a fact sheet, because some people, as Tash points out, might not read it. We are giving politicians an incentive to move away from vitriol and move away from vilification and properly inform their voters. Sarah Palin, David Cameron, The Sun, we're coming for you. I am proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Matt for his speech and invite Anser to close out the case for Cambridge, the opposition bench, and the debate as a whole.
The entire case of government bench tried to hammer one point. If we do this, the poor's interest will be looked after better. Two mechanisms. One, richer people will become more aware of the consequences policies have on the poor and will feel more for them and will hence vote more responsibly. Secondly, poorer people will know what's better for them and hence vote responsibly. Here is the problem. Just because you know a lot about current affairs doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to vote in the best interest of the poor. In fact, as Ashish told you, the rich and the poor often have mutually conflicting interests. If I'm rich, I want low taxation, low capital gains, low spending on welfare, easier mobility. I don't want more money being spent on welfare. I don't want higher taxation. And we both agree that doing this policy will shift voting towards the richer bloc. So just because people know more doesn't necessarily mean that they will care more. And we think that you'll have a bunch of people who are more informed, but are still going to vote for low taxation, still going to vote for their interests because they're mutually conflictual with the poor. The correlation between being a world's finalist and a morally commendable person is not strong. Secondly, they told us that basically this will ensure that the poor are able to know more about their self-interests. First of all, if you look at the overwhelming majority of the world, the poor tend to vote for left-leaning, pro-welfare, pro-benefits, pro-social support parties. If you want to make the empirical claim that in the majority of instances they vote for crazy right-wingers, you are just lying or either yourself ignorant of the majority of current affairs in human history. Second, the only example they gave of this were two types of people, Southern Americans and racists. Well, we think for Southern Americans, things like abortion, Things like the death penalty, things like the conviction in like the Republicans are the party of God are the reasons why they tend to, in majority, vote for the Republicans. Not that they're all deluded. The other ones, because they're hardcore libertarians, which we think is a perfectly sound philosophical position. The only other example he gave was UKIP. That's because sometimes the intensity of being a racist tends to cloud out your knowledge about current affairs. Second point, this will lead to incentives to educate the poor. Well, first of all, you've already conceded that you're shifting voting incentive towards the rich, which means that if a party wants to be successful in your world, it's not really smart to invest in education for the poor, campaigns. What are you going to do? Go to here, have an economist, please read it. The test is in like 2 weeks. You've got to come do this. No. You're going to cater to the rich and compete for the rich vote because they are the people who tend to be more educated, tend to have all the current things. So, this is, no thank you, this is like literally saying that if we give white South Africans 10 times more votes, everyone's going to try and lobby the poor. No, they're going to go to the demographic that you just artificially inflated. No thank you. We also say, since everyone seems to have conceded that this demographic tends to vote Republican, tends to vote conservative, tends to vote in the interest against the poor, if this debate on opening bench was we need to help the poor, the one mantra that went down the bench, you're doing the exact opposite. But secondly, why do we think the poor people can't be educated quickly? No, thank you. First, we've talked about opportunity cost and lack of time. We've talked about the lack in quality of education that they already received. We say the fact that they might have to work a lot more, have harder, less leisurable lives. We say also, most of all, and you conceded this, poor people are disenfranchised by the system. They feel alienated and hence they don't want to vote. In fact, we've noticed, in a minute opening, we've noticed that if you put polling booths a bit far away, voter turnout decreases rapidly in poorer constituencies. Imagine what will happen when they get a letter saying your vote is worth 1/50th of the middle class people who are screwing over your interests. Will that make them more likely to vote, or will that encourage them to stay at home? Opening.
Okay, answer. When a state raises taxes, cuts benefits, or goes to war, they do so and they're legitimate in doing so because they hold the mandate of their public. If their public doesn't know what they're voting for, why are they legitimate in exercising those actions?
Brilliant. Our extension. We think that there are 4 reasons. We disagree with the premise that your knowledge of current affairs makes you the best voter. Otherwise, we should all have a technocracy. Right? Because presumably, no matter how knowledgeable you are, someone will be more knowledgeable. And the more knowledgeable person, consequently, will probably, under their logic, make the better decision. So why don't we have the most knowledgeable Leviathan running everything? No, thank you. 4 reasons. First, because we think that often in democracies, you can just have a strong intensity of preferences on one issue. You can understand it better than everyone, you can know it and feel it better than anyone, and thus we don't want to cloud and diminish your voice. Now, and constantly we talk about the LGBT community, we can talk about Muslim voters, we can talk about minority voters, we can talk about like any kind of group that cares strongly about one issue. The only response we got, well, it's better for them to know more about other issues. Our point is that you set up a starting cost. You make it harder for these people to express the true intensity of their preferences, and they're the only people who feel that intensity. Yeah, and that is why, no thank you, we think voting on single issues is legitimate. It is an essential part of democracy. Secondly, we also think that individuals are nearly always the best experts on the current affairs that surround their lives. We don't think that a bureaucratic test on world affairs conforms to the daily interactions and the numerous thousands, Cheng Wu will like this word, data points that you are able to accumulate in that course. Second, we talked about character voters. Look, when I vote someone into power, I can't basically be sure of what's going to happen next in the world. Something new might come up, some new issue might come up. But often we trust them. We trust them because we see them as morally commendable, people we like, people we entrust. That's why it's representative, delegated democracy. The problem is, people who might be very good at making moral judgments, character judgments, are put as less important than people who have knowledge of current affairs for some arbitrary, random reason. Finally, we told you this is going to just entrench structures of power in which parties cater to the rich as opposed to the poor, and that is problematic. Finally, why do we have democracy? We don't have democracy because we want to basically lead to the best possible outcome. We have democracy because we want to aggregate preferences. Some of those preferences are based on your knowledge, but a lot of them aren't, and they are equally important. We are very proud to oppose.